when you look at Minnesota in the last 3 years, it's been pretty hit or miss. The reason why for this, it's primarily because of their expensive ass quarterback, Kirk Cousins, who signed onto the team in the 2018 offseason from Washington, and the questionable in-game decisions made by their head coach, Mike Zimmer. Now, since that time period, they had some mixed success. They went 8-7-1, falling short of a playoff berth in the final week of the regular season. And 2019 saw them have their first postseason berth since 2017. Remember the Minneapolis Miracle? Well, they had somewhat of a miracle during the playoffs. They got lucky with sneaking away with pass interference in the wildcard game against the New Orleans Saints, but they didn't get so lucky trying to pull off an upset against the San Francisco 49ers in the divisional playoffs. But nonetheless, they didn't really follow up with any success in 2020, going 7-9, primarily because they gave up a crap ton of points. Kirk Cousins couldn't get his team back into the game because of that. So going into 2021, a lot of questions about Kirk Cousins' job security as well as Mike Zimmer's as a result, especially for Kirk Cousins, because during the 2021 draft, General Manager Rick Spielman drafted Texas A&M quarterback Kellen Mond in the 3rd round of the draft. And during that same offseason, it wasn't also a particularly notable one for Minnesota because they didn't have a lot of money to spend, and they didn't really nail most of their draft picks aside from one that I'm going to be mentioning. In free agency, they really only added corner Patrick Peterson and safety Xavier Woods, while in the draft, their first round pick was Virginia Tech's offensive tackle Christian Darrisaw, who looked pretty damn good in college. But other than that, pretty much Minnesota had nearly the same roster it had in 2020. And honestly, it was just looking to do more than just be a bottom filler team and just make the playoffs. So, looking at their season, looking at 2021 in their games, the Vikings honestly could have made the playoffs. It's just a matter of things going better for them. They were in some pretty competitive one-score games for much of the season. The thing was, they were either no defense from Minnesota or lack thereof, or it was because Kirk Cousins was doing some Kirk Cousins things and doing a lot of checkdowns or turning the ball over. So it was pretty much defense not having any defense, or Kirk Cousins doing some Kirk Cousins things. So there are also some losses caused by Mike Zimmer's decisions to either take the ball out of Kirk Cousins' hands during games where Kirk Cousins was actually doing pretty damn well in the game. And instead, Zimmer preferred to hand the ball over to Dalvin Cook and Alexander Madison, that running back tandem. So pretty odd decisions there from Mike Zimmer. I mean, I get it. Kirk Cousins makes boneheaded turnovers in some games, especially under pressure. And oftentimes those lead to losses. And I get it. The secondary, that's related to the offense, but the secondary gets torched in coverage. But either way, Mike Zimmer kind of has to trust his quarterback just a little bit. Nonetheless, they lost a larger majority of those one-score games that they were in because of the issues I just mentioned. And, they could have at least been a wild card team. They honestly could have been at least a wild card team to speak of, if not for those pressing issues and kind of dysfunction, to be honest with you. Plenty of winnable games on the board for the Minnesota Vikings, like the Cleveland Browns game, where pretty much nobody could score in that one. The Arizona Cardinals game, Greg Joseph missing the potential game winner. The Dallas Cowboys game, no Dak Prescott, and yet Kirk Cousins stunk up the joint in that game. The Baltimore Ravens game, not sure what happened there in that one. And then, of course, when you get to late in the season, it's a decent opportunity for the Vikings to get the 7th and final spot in the NFC playoffs. But then there were two games that really, really sunk them down. 2 games that sunk down their season. And that was the losses to their division rivals against the Detroit Lions in week 13 and the Packers in week 17. In that game against Detroit, they were down big. They were down big. Kirk Cousins didn't look good in that game until the second half, where they managed to come back, take the lead. But then their defense, their secondary, like I mentioned, was often got torched, and they got torched again in the final moments of the game, where Jared Goff was leading the charge, and the defense really allowed an open catch by Amon-Ra St. Brown in the end zone to give the Lions their first win all year. And then meanwhile, when you look at the Packers game in a critical week 17, where the Vikings literally had to win just to stay alive, keep their playoff hopes alive, just 2 days prior, that primetime game on NBC, the worst case scenario happens for the Minnesota Vikings. Kirk Cousins, who was unvaccinated, tests positive for COVID, and he can't play the game. He cannot play in that big game against the Packers, and his absence alone completely felt. The Vikings literally tried to play the entire game with Dalvin Cook and Alexander Mattison, but to no effect. The Packers defense suddenly clinched up. Aaron Rodgers went off on Minnesota, and not even Kellen Mond could save them in that game. So overall, the Minnesota Vikings, not a bad team per se. They had some talent. When you look at some of the team members that had some really productive seasons, like Kirk Cousins, despite some questionable decision making, a very more aggressive quarterback in the last 2 seasons. I mean, even though he still plays it safe at times, but you could see a little bit more aggression from him during some big games. You also had the tandem of Dalvin Cook and Alexander Mattison, which was the Vikings' strong suit in the offense. And Justin Jefferson, their second-year receiver, continued his surge as one of the league's top receivers, and even supplanted Adam Thielen as Kirk Cousins' preferred target. Defensively, Eric Kendricks and Cameron Byron were probably the only players that were productive and a key part in the Vikings, at least trying to stay afloat on defense. But, they went 8-9. Not a bad team per se, but they just really let things slip out of their hands, especially on the defensive end, or vice versa at times. And that loss to the Packers in week 17 really sealed it. So 8-9 was enough for ownership to finally show Mike Zimmer and Rick Spielman out the door after the season. And later they brought in Kwesi Adofo-Mensah. He was a former football vice operations manager, vice president of football operations manager. Sorry about that. And Kevin O'Connell, he's the Rams offensive coordinator, and he was fresh off of a Super Bowl win with Matthew Stafford. So, for as much success, or maybe not so much success, that these guys had in their previous roles, it remains to be seen how both of these guys can do in their respective roles. For Mensah, it remains to be seen how he can entice players to come to the Vikings. For O'Connell, how can he turn around Kirk Cousins' career? How can he get him to become a better quarterback, like he tried to do with Matthew Stafford this past season? Either way, looking at the Vikings in 2022, it's going to be a wait-and-see approach, to be honest with you. Going into this offseason, you have a lot of things to work on, especially when your back is against the wall with terms of money. Yeah, $15 million in the red, minus $15 million. Large majority of that is because of Kirk Cousins' fat-ass contract, which we'll get into it in a bit. Your key free agents include Patrick Peterson, linebacker Anthony Barr, edge Everson Griffin, and your kicker Greg Joseph, who is a restricted free agent. So pretty much the Vikings can match any offer that other teams offer Greg Joseph. Their current draft position is at 12, and some of the things that they need to address, the biggest thing they needed to address is the corner position. So I feel like in my mind that Patrick Peterson probably is not going to get re-signed in Minnesota because he couldn't stay healthy all season long unless he takes a 1-year prove-it deal just to see how things are in terms of his playing ability. But either way, the Minnesota Vikings need to get a corner. They need to get someone with lockdown ability. So this free agency market and the draft is littered with talent in in this corner position. Otherwise, well, the Vikings are going to be in a lot of one-scoring positions or maybe even more blowouts in 2022. They got to add help in the pass rush, especially if they lose Anthony Barr in free agency, and they got to restructure Kirk Cousins' contract because Kirk Cousins is in the final year of his current deal, but his final year carries a big-ass cap hit of $45 million. Yeah, you know what that $45 million can do for everyone else on this team? Well, or for Adofo-Mensah? Well, I mean, it can go towards finding new players, enticing them to come to Minnesota. But Kirk Cousins, yeah, his fat-ass contract is eating up all the money that Minnesota can spend in free agency. So Adofo-Mensah, yeah, to redo his deal. If he doesn't, I don't know what's wrong with him. Well, it's clearly something wrong with him, but he has to address that one key area in free agency. Otherwise, how is he going to address anything in a couple of weeks, let alone the draft? So overall, the Vikings were a team in the end kind of complacent for the last 2 years until they weren't by season's end in 2021. In terms of their current roster, you got mostly everyone still under contract for the next season or two. But do you really want more of the same? Do you really want more of the same for 2022 and beyond? I mean, sure, they finally got rid of Mike Zimmer, but you still face a lot of uncertainty under Kevin O'Connell. So no one knows what to expect in 2022, even with most of the roster back. The one thing that they need to address, though, is whether or not Kirk Cousins is their guy. Kirk Cousins has his moments, but I guess he's a solid quarterback. But they have to rework his deal. Get that $45 million reduced enough to get the Vikings under the salary cap. If not, well, they're not going to be able to improve the roster, and they're going to be seeing a lot of the same this fall.